Hi, I'm Philip Kemp, and for those of you who enjoy voiceover commentaries, I'll be talking us through this release of the last of the great Ealing comedies, Alexander McKendrick's The Ladykillers. Though Ealing comedy is known and loved the world over, the cycle had quite a short life. It's generally reckoned to have started with Charles Crichton's Hue and Cry in 1947. By 1955, when The Ladykillers was released, the cycle was showing distinct signs of running down. Late entries such as the Titfield Thunderbolt lent themselves to charges of being cosy and complacent. And then, right at the end, came one last masterpiece of pitch-black comedy, The Ladykillers. It was also, as it happens, one of the last films to be produced at Ealing Studios before they were sold to the BBC. Now, here we see two of the film's main characters, Mrs. Wilberforce, played by Katie Johnson, and the ramshackle little house she lives in, near St Pancras Station in London. I'll come back to both of them in due course.
Good morning.
The Ladykillers started life as a dream. One night, William Rose, the film's screenwriter, an American expatriate who also wrote Genevieve and The Smallest Show on Earth, had a dream which, he recalled, wasn't like any dream I've ever had. It was whole and complete, and it was original. It was about 5 criminals who lived in a house with a little old lady, and she found them out. They decided they had to kill her, but they couldn't, so they all killed each other.
Good morning, Superintendent.
The next day, Rose recounted his dream in the Red Lion on Ealing Green, the studio personnel's favourite watering hole, and was overheard by Alexander McKendrick. Rose had scripted McKendrick's previous film, The Maggie. So, on the face of it, the teaming seemed perfect. But Rose, who was notoriously short-fused, and McKendrick, famously stubborn and perfectionist, had fallen out. According to McKendrick, Rose had stormed off the set yelling, "Never, never, not if my children are starving in the street will I work with McKendrick again." But McKendrick had fallen in love with the idea. It appealed to what he once called my perverted and malicious sense of humour, and manoeuvred Rose into collaborating with him. He was particularly taken with Rose's dictum, "Inside the worst of men is that little touch of goodness that will utterly destroy him." Together they presented the idea to the head of the studio, Michael Balkan. Rose vividly recalled the occasion. "I told the story to Mick, and he watched me with those strange hooded eyes. Just once in a while he glanced at Sandy as if to say, 'Is it just he who has lost his mind, or have you both lost your minds?' And then he leaned forward, fingertips joined together, and said, 'Just let me get this straight. You have 6 principal actors, and at the end of the film, 5 of them are dead. And you say this is a comedy?' Despite Balkan's misgivings, the production went ahead. Over 3 months, Rose, McKendrick, and their producer Seth Holt met for story conferences, fleshing out the basic idea. Rose's masterstroke, which he may have borrowed, consciously or otherwise, from the 1938 Hollywood comedy thriller The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse, scripted by John Huston, was to have the gang pose as a classical string quintet. Originally, the role of Professor Marcus was intended for Alistair Sim, who specialised in sinister eccentrics. But Ealing had done well with its run of films starring Alec Guinness, and Balkan, mindful of the box office, insisted Guinness should be offered the role. Guinness, suspecting that he wasn't the initial choice, turns in a masterful pastiche of Sim's mannerisms, while still making the role entirely his own. Cecil Parker, as the phony genteel conman Major Courtney, and Herbert Lom as Louis, the sharp-suited Soho hood, made perfect casting. For Harry, the teddy boy, Balkan proposed Richard Attenborough, a regular choice for young hoodlums ever since playing teenage gang leader Pinky in John Boulting's Brighton Rock. But McKendrick and Holt were both keen fans of the cult radio comedy The Goon Show, one of whose cast was an ambitious young actor called Peter Sellers. Thanks to their advocacy, he got the role, and with it, his screen breakthrough. He also landed an additional assignment, providing the voices for all Mrs. Wilberforce's parrots. Danny Green, a genuine ex-boxer who completed the gang as failed boxer one round, had taken a supporting role in a long-forgotten film from 1937 called Midnight Menace, which McKendrick had co-scripted with his cousin Roger McDougall. A bigger casting problem was Mrs. Wilberforce, the sweet, innocent little old lady who unwittingly foils the gang's plans. McKendrick has set his heart on Katie Johnson, a little-known veteran actress who had been taking bit parts in films since 1932. But by now she was 79, which would mean additional insurance costs on the budget. McKendrick also faced opposition from Holt, who told him, "Sandy, I know you. You're a ruthless bastard. You're going to kill that poor woman, and I'm not having her on my conscience." McKendrick, outmanoeuvring his producer as he had his scriptwriter, negotiated a special insurance deal for Johnson and got Balkan's approval, much to Holt's indignation. But Katie Johnson, having got wind of the arguments, came to McKendrick and offered to pay the extra insurance costs out of her own savings, which moved the usually unsentimental director to tears. The biggest casting problem of all, though, was the house. McKendrick, a trained artist, had sketched exactly what he wanted, and Ealing's location scouts combed North London, to no avail. Finally, perfectionist as ever, he decided to have it built from scratch. The chosen location was at the end of a cul-de-sac, Frederica Street, about a mile north of St Pancras, which is why, if you look closely, you can spot an interesting continuity error. The front of Mrs W's house apparently looks out on the magnificent Victorian pile of Gilbert Scott's St Pancras Station. Shots were taken in Argyle Street, where Camden Council currently have their offices. But from the back of the house, St Pancras can be glimpsed again in the far distance. This also explains why, if you search for Mrs Wilberforce's house, sorry, but you're doomed to disappointment. Though it cost nearly as much to build as a real one, the house was built of plaster and was demolished when shooting was finished. But the Frederica Street site had a great advantage. It was positioned over the entrance to the Caledonia Tunnel, straddling the main line from King's Cross. The steam trains, whose melancholy whistles punctuate the action and that play such a major role in the second half of the film, were right there, ready to be used. Besides having a building specially constructed for the film, McKendrick had ideas about getting some demolished. He loved high, God's eye view overhead angles. You'll have noticed that the film starts with just such a shot, and was delighted to find that the King's Cross area, where the robbery was to be carried out, incorporated a clutch of Victorian gasometers. These, he felt, would provide a perfect vantage point, and he clambered up to the top of one of them, taking with him the unit's production manager, David Pears. Pears was disconcerted to find that the top of the gasometer wasn't level, but curved down towards the edge, and that there was no safety railing around it. "Sandy just marched across this thing," he recalled, "up to the top and down again all round the edge. I was scared out of my bloody wits, but Sandy didn't seem to have a nerve in his body. Anyway, he was much too engrossed in seeing if we could get the angle. Pity that building's just there," he'd say. "Of course we could get a wonderful shot if... I wonder, it's probably empty. Perhaps we could have the roof knocked off or something." And I would solemnly have to go and see if it was possible to knock down half the building. Of course it wasn't. Finally, McKendrick rejected the gasometers, in favour of a 70-foot rostrum. With some difficulty, Piers persuaded him to settle for a telescopic extension ladder.
Understand all that? We're going to have a game.
McKendrick's characteristic obsession with details extended to the stolen money, the proceeds of the heist. Normally at that time, phony Mickey Mouse money was used in movies, but McKendrick demanded something looking convincingly like the real thing. Some members of the production team later claimed he held out for real banknotes, but this story he always denied. After negotiation with the Treasury, special dispensation was given for near facsimiles to be used, but only on condition that the props man kept them under lock and key and scrupulously counted them after each day's shoot. McKendrick also insisted that the amount of money stolen should be consistent with the plot. At one point, the entire haul has to fit into 1 round's cello case. Just what quantity of £1 and 10-shilling notes, he asked, could a cello case hold? Notes of larger denominations were rare in those days. It fell to Michael Burkitt, the third assistant director, in other words, the dog's body, to find out. He took a cello case down to his local bank and, with the manager's amused cooperation, filled it with banknotes. It turned out that the maximum was about £60,000, a fairly modest haul, even for those days. To check the mechanics of the robbery, McKendrick consulted Scotland Yard, where he had contacts from his days of working on the film of The Blue Lamp. I went along to see a chief inspector, he later explained, and said, I wonder if you'd mind reading this and seeing what you think about how the robbery is planned, and if it would work. A few days later, this chap called me in again and said, Mr. McKendrick, we'd just as soon you stuck to making films. I asked, it would work, would it? He said, it would work all too well. I took that as a great compliment.
Come in.
We're just coming to one of the key scenes in the film. Let's break off from the pre-production background and take a moment to see how cunningly this scene is constructed, how it sets up everything that follows.
I do hope.
McKendrick always liked to refer, rather sardonically, to the sordid carpentry of imparting information and laying fuses.
So much about you.
But of course, it's precisely this sordid carpentry, if it's done right, that can make a good script.
Thank you.
So here, in the space of some 5 minutes, including a couple of cutaways to Mrs. W downstairs, we're given a wealth of information, all the film's key points and thematic elements. We find out there's to be a robbery, and that Mrs. W will play a vital role in it, though exactly what's being stolen and how she fits in is withheld to whet our curiosity. We hear, for the first time, the Boccherini minuet that's to become the theme tune of the film. It's the third movement of his string quintet in E major, Op. 13, No. 5, fact fans, though, in fact, it's originally scored for a quintet with 2 cellos. We're shown the characters of the gang members and their relationships with each other. We see One Round's lumpen sentimentality, Marcus's megalomania, the dangerous rivalry between Marcus and Louis. We get the ritual of voting, which will later be reprised in the drawing of murderous lots, and a hint of the insanity that will trigger the final showdown. And, midway through this scene, we get a crucial interruption. For the tensions of the film to play out convincingly, it's essential that the figure of Mrs. Wilberforce appears equal in stature to Marcus and his gang. And here we learn what motivates her. Intruding into the gang's quarrel to offer them tea, that most classically Ealing of drinks, she lingers to reminisce. The Boccherini minuet has reminded her of her 21st birthday party and the news of Queen Victoria's death. It's as if something of the aged Queen's authority, at once absurd yet formidable, has been passed on. And it's Mrs. W's roots in the certitude of Victorian values that will give her the strength to stand against the gang and ultimately destroy them. But, of course, they also destroyed themselves. And this too is foreshadowed, literally, in this scene. Notice how McKendrick choreographs the action, placing each gang member, both literally and psychologically. As the tension builds, The lighting drops in both intensity and angle, as though a cloud of darkness was seeping from Marcus's twisted mind. The Gothic shadows are dispelled by Mrs. W's cheery re-entrance. Shall I be mother? But only temporarily. The tension remains unresolved, and the shadows will gather again.
Not quite, though we are rather proud of Mr. Harvey's term.
And that
While McKendrick was planning the film, Guinness too was making his own preparations to play the mad genius of Professor Marcus. McKendrick found the process fascinating. The period in which Alec is exploring a character, he said, is a magical one for the director. He has a strange habit of working from the outside in. In the early stages, he's very much a putty-nosed character, working off gimmicks, funny voices and so on. But then he gets it down and discards the essentials and finds the core of the character, even when he's dealing with a comic grotesque as in the Ladykillers. Guinness's first idea, apparently, was to play Marcus as a cripple. McKendrick remembered him, quote, sidling across my office as though he had a dislocated hip, which was quite gruesome but horrendously funny. So Seth and I had to say, no, sorry, Alec, but Mick Balkan will never stand for that. Alec got rather annoyed and sulked for a bit and went and looked out of the window. And while I was talking about the script, he was snipping away with a pair of scissors. And he made some paper teeth, which he stuck in, then turned round and grinned at me. In effect, Guinness had internalised his initial idea. The deformed grin became the outward sign of a brilliant, dislocated mind. A recurrent gag in the film is that Marcus verges on physical violence if anyone, usually Louis, hints that he's mad.
I just don't think we can depend on a screwy old dad.
McKendrick later speculated that the concept of Marcus as teetering on the edge of insanity may have been started as a macabre joke by William Rose at his own expense. Bill was at one time, McKendrick said, very near the edge himself. He went in private terror on the subject of his own sanity. It wasn't a subject on which the screenwriter tolerated jokes from anyone else. Well before shooting started, he quit the production, leaving his final draft incomplete, after taking umbrage at an unguarded remark from Seth Holt. During a script conference, as McKendrick recalled it, Seth jokingly told Bill that he was mad. And Bill got terribly angry, exactly as Marcus does in the film, and said he'd been deeply insulted. I tried to placate him on the lines of, well, you're no madder than the rest of us, we're all fairly dotty here. Bill wouldn't accept it, and Seth wouldn't apologise. So Bill said, I'm finished. I'm not going to write any more for you. I won't see the rough cut, and I won't even come to the premiere. And he stormed off in a fury.
Well, now, shall I be mother?
Rose's script broke off at the point where one round is dropped into a train. The last 5 minutes of the film, the showdown between Marcus and Louis, and Mrs. Wilberforce's confession to the police, were written by McKendrick and Holt, working from Rose's notes. The Ladykillers was McKendrick's first film in colour. I'll note the way here, incidentally, that since Marcus is now, as it were, performing what he does best, he's wearing an artist's beret, a nice little touch. Like many directors of his generation, McKendrick always felt happier working in black and white. I don't think, as a director, you're ever in control of colour, he once remarked. Even less so, since this was one of the last films to be shot in the old 3-strip Technicolor process. It was bad enough that the process involved a huge, cumbersome camera built like an old-fashioned refrigerator. Doors and corridors had to be widened to allow it through, and certain tracking movements, from Mrs. Wilberforce's sitting room out into the hall, for example, were impossible. It says a lot for McKendrick's skill, and for the skill of his cinematographer, Otto Heller, that the film retains a high degree of camera mobility, and that the editing remains, for the most part, unobtrusive.
Major Courtney, I wonder if perhaps you'd like some tea.
Even more frustrating to McKendrick was the brashness of 3-strip Technicolor stock. What he wanted, he later explained, quote, was a very crisp, strong tonal range between black and white, but fairly muted hues, all in greys and browns and greens. But with 3-strip Technicolor, In order to get a strong black, you had to intensify all the colours. The first day's rushes were brilliantly hued like a beer ad, quite impossible. We had to stop production and repaint the set, adding grey to bring all the colours down. We had it worked out in great detail, with each of the characters colour-coded. Louis was black and verdigris, the Professor is mildew, browns and dusty shades, Harry is allowed a little brighter colour, and one round's just a great big grey. And then you have the absurdity of Mrs. W, all high key and pastels. But I don't think it worked. As so often, McKendrick is perhaps being too critical of his own work. The misty, sombre tones that he finally achieved may lack the strong tonal range between black and white he wanted, but they do suit the film's vision of a world trapped, submerged even, in a dank Victorian past, and enhance its pervasive sense of dreamlike fantasy. Early on in the film, Mrs. Wilberforce visits the police station to tell them that her friend Amelia wasn't, in fact, visited by aliens in flying saucers, but had dreamt up the whole thing. One reading of the Ladykillers would be to treat it all as Mrs. Wilberforce's dream, with the gang as monsters of the id, conjured up from the depths of her psyche. In this Freudian interpretation, we could take them as an expression of repressed tendencies to violence, to antisocial behaviour, within the respectable old lady herself, the dark side of Victorian morality. The gang themselves are cartoonish characters, much more 19th century than 20th. Even Harry, representative of 50s youth culture, seems a bit old to be a teddy boy. What they look like, in fact, is what an old lady such as Mrs. Wilberforce, drawing on confused memories of books and plays and films, might well imagine a gang of criminals to be. Some critics have detected a political subtext. In his classic book on Ealing, Charles Barr suggests an ingenious reading of the film as political allegory. Quote, "The gang are the post-war Labour government. Taking over the House, they gratify the Conservative incumbent by their civilised behaviour, that nice music, and decide to use at least the facade of respectability for their radical programme of redistributing wealth. Their success is undermined by two factors interacting: their own internecine quarrels and the startling, paralysing charisma of the natural governing class, which effortlessly takes over from them again in time to exploit their gains, like the Conservatives taking over power from Labour in 1951, just as the austerity years come to an end. The gang are a social mix, like Labour's, a mix of academic, the Professor, ex-officer, Major Courtney, manual worker, one round, naive youth, Harry, and hardliner, Louis. It's an enjoyable interpretation, probably not meant to be taken entirely seriously. But what can't be missed is the way McKendrick and Rose use Mrs. W and her ramshackle old house to satirise both Ealing and Britain. William Rose lived in Britain most of his adult life, and certainly loved it. But in almost all his films, you can detect a mixture of exasperation, affection, irony, and reluctant admiration for the hidebound, muddling through country he had adopted. The same is true of McKendrick, who was also born a US citizen, though unlike Rose he moved to Britain, and specifically to Scotland, as a child. So in Mrs. Wilberforce, with the to and fro of her invincibly ignorant benevolence, to borrow a phrase from the late Raymond Durgnat, we're seeing the Victorian past in which the post-imperial Britain of the 1950s seemed hopelessly mired. Her style of dressing evidently hasn't changed in 50 years. Her house, awash as it is with fringes, knickknacks and flowery wallpaper, seems to contain not a single modern appliance, no radio, telephone or refrigerator, not even piped hot water. Her friends have names redolent of potpourri and lavender water, lettuce, Constance, Hypatia, and her parrots are named after bewhiskered heroes of the Empire, General Gordon, Admiral Beatty. Her London is a village street where everyone knows her by name, and at the local police station, Jack Warner, resurrected and promoted from his Sergeant Dixon of the Blue Lamp, presides over a troop of friendly bobbies straight out of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta.
No, thank you, Mrs. Wilberforce, no tea, thank you.
This was McKendrick's last Ealing film. His attitude to the studio had always been deeply ambivalent. On the one hand, Ealing had given him his start, helped him to find his way in the industry and direct his first film, and, through its management structure of benevolent paternalism, allowed him to get on with making films at his own pace without having to worry about doing deals or where the funding was coming from. But on the other hand, he was finding it increasingly claustrophobic, parochial in its unquestioning patriotism. Balkan, always cautious, wary of anything audacious or unusual, had vetoed McKendrick's more ambitious projects, A High Wind in Jamaica, which he later made under fraught circumstances for 20th Century Fox, and Mary Queen of Scots. Nor was there much chance that any other British studio would be willing to back his projects. The giant rank organisation, Ealing's paymaster, was even more conservative in its outlook than Ealing. Alexander Korda's British Lion was, as usual, cash-strapped, and Korda himself was tiring and would be dead within a few months. Altogether, McKendrick was feeling frustrated, and The Ladykillers has an unmistakably valedictory air to it, an irreverent farewell not only to England but also to Ealing, the cottage film studio on the village green, with its roses and beehives and its sentimental attachment to age and eccentricity. The Englishness of Ealing, the Ealingness of England. In the imagery of The Ladykillers, the two concepts overlap and merge. The house, in which nothing hangs straight, has been knocked askew by wartime bombs. Its plumbing works erratically, if at all. Just behind it run steam trains, already obsolescent, soon to be scrapped or banished to tourist Titfields in Sussex or Wales. Its position, at the end of a dead-end street, speaks for itself. In the heist sequence, which we're watching at the moment, the gang for once managed to cooperate with admirable efficiency. This is something we'll see happening only once more during the course of the film. Throughout his life, McKendrick felt himself to some degree an outsider. He liked to describe himself as operating, quote, in enemy terrain, unquote. An American growing up in Scotland, he moved there with his family at the age of 6, a Scot in England, and later in his career a Briton in America. He always kept the outsider's quizzical, slightly detached gaze. And outsiders, think of Fritz Lang and Billy Wilder in the USA, Joseph Losey and Richard Lester in Britain, Jules Dassin in France and Greece, can often see things that will escape the native born. In any case, McKendrick had always stood slightly apart from the Ealing mainstream, with its tendency towards consensus and reconciliation. Contrast the ending of Passport to Pimlico, one of the best of the Ealing mainstream comedies, with the ending of McKendrick's first feature as director, Whiskey Galore. Both films involve the defiance of officialdom by a small, self-enclosed community. But at the end of Passport, there's an outdoor banquet where the people of Pimlico, who had declared independence from Britain, are reabsorbed back into the community, symbolised by the ration books that appear in front of each of them on the table. And the ministry officials who had opposed them now sit down at the same table with them. Order and normality are restored. Now consider the ending of Whiskey Galore. The people of the Hebridean island of Todde get to keep their contraband whiskey. The customs officials who came to look for it have to retire empty-handed. And the wretched Major Waggett, head of the local Home Guard and embodiment of civic virtue and the rule of law, is driven from the island, his efforts futile, his reputation in ruins, blown away in a great gale of contemptuous Scots laughter. Precious little consensus and reconciliation there.
Disturbance at King's Cross.
McKendrick's name is often linked with that of Robert Hamer, the other maverick figure of Ealing and director of the other great Ealing black comedy Kind Hearts and Coronets. Hamer too felt averse to the consensus mode of Ealing and had ambitions to make films that would question the status quo. But Hamer tended to confront the Ealing establishment, and particularly Michael Balkan, head-on, which generally led to his ultimate defeat. and may well have contributed to the alcoholism that killed him. McKendrick, more devious, explores and subverts the Ealing ethos, turning it against itself. On the face of it, the Ladykillers fits the late Ealing mould, celebrating little and old and eccentric. But in showing us, as he also does in The Man in the White Suit and Mandy, a whole apparatus of social convention moving in to stifle the disruptive elements, he implicitly questions the traditional values that Ealing always held so dear.
Urgent message begins. Car believed concerned in armed robbery, King's Cross area, found abandoned in Field Street.
The score of The Ladykillers is worth close attention. It's the work of Tristram Carey, a composer of musique concrète, and McKendrick took the unusual step of inviting him to compose the sound effects as well as the music. So the mournful train whistles are all part of Carey's score, as are some witty oral puns, like the machine gun chatter of a distant motorcycle that we hear as Louis makes his first appearance, his violin case held at the approved Chicago angle. Carey also provides a series of leitmotifs. Mrs. Wilberforce gets a tinkling music box arrangement of the sentimental old drawing-room ballad The Last Rose of Summer, though after the gang have set up residence, this changes to the Boccherini minuet. We also have a purposeful fugue for the heist, shimmering string arpeggios for the money, and an ominous triple figure of descending thirds to indicate murder. And for the various deaths that round off the plot, Carey makes gleeful use of parody. The Major gets the last post, plus the coda of a four-square Anglican hymn. For Harry, there's a snatch of 12-bar blues. And Professor Marcus's short-lived triumph is celebrated with a few bars of Elgarian nobilmente.
You mean going out or coming in?
The original script of The Ladykillers, which still survives, having managed to escape the bonfire that was perpetrated by the BBC when they took over the studios in 1955, was quite a lot longer, and in fact a good deal of other footage was shot. But it was not usual for an Ealing comedy to run more than 95 minutes, and quite a few choice scenes have vanished. And alas, the footage probably was burnt by the BBC, so we may never see it. A pity, because reading some of the scenes in the script, you can hear them. They're beautifully written. There's one snatch of conversation I've always loved, which is when Professor Marcus has just been shown the rooms with the trains outside. If you remember, he gazes at the scene of smoke and steam and says, "Most exhilarating." There was then a discussion between Mrs. Wilberforce and Professor Marcus when she explained that the rooms had previously belonged to a Mr. Proudfoot, who loved them because he was a train spotter and collected train numbers. A few moments later, at the bottom of the stairs, just before he's to take his leave, Professor Marcus turns to Mrs. Wilberforce with a puzzled air. "Mrs. Wilberforce, tell me, what did Mr. Proudfoot do with the numbers that he collected?" It's a lovely line, but that had to go. Also a bit later, when, if you remember, the Major's sob story about his poor old mother is being tried out on Mrs. Wilberforce in an attempt to soften her, there was another scene, or rather a following monologue by Peter Sellers, in which he told the sad story of his sister, who, in order to keep the family finances going, had been forced to perform in a circus on the high wire, and scared of heights. But that too had to go, much to Sellers' chagrin, because this was his breakthrough role and he wanted it to shine out as much as possible.
Back to the station. What's wrong?
Major! Louis,
Major,
Louis,
tell me what's happening.
Louis.
Major!
Will you mind your own business, please?
And we've just missed the venue for another missing scene that I've always rather regretted, which is when Mrs. Wilberforce first comes out of the station before she finds she's lost her umbrella. She gets into the wrong taxi. The taxi is being driven by a much-loved character actor of the period called Sam Kidd, and after a moment or two, Mrs. Wilberforce looks at him rather puzzledly and says, "Excuse me, "But have you grown a moustache?" At which point, of course, she realises and has to be taken back yet again into the station.
She could have shopped us all.
We're now approaching what, to be honest, I must admit is my least favourite part of the film, the episode with Frankie Howard as the Barrow Boy. To me, and obviously anyone can think different, Howard's overbroad TV comic style of acting seems to me out of sync with the rest of the film. However, it was part of a long-standing Ealing tradition which was continued right up to its very last days of employing comedians as actors.
Do you mind?
George Formby, Will Hay, Tommy Trinder, even Benny Hill and Harry Seacombe
Will you mind your own business?
were all roped in to play supposedly dramatic roles. But, as usually happens when comedians take dramatic roles, they really just played themselves. And to me, that's what Frankie Howard does in this long, I find, overextended sequence.
Look, Mrs., will you mind your own business?
What it does do, of course, and does very effectively, is set up the quality of unwitting destruction embodied by Mrs. Wilberforce. You may have noticed quite early on in the film, Mrs. Wilberforce having an encounter with a baby on the steps of the police station. Now, in the original script, this was going to be a rather over-contrived Mr. Magoo type sequence where she's narrowly missed by a wrecking ball swinging from a crane, which is then deflected and demolishes a couple of cars. Somebody, possibly McKendrick, possibly Rose, decided this was a bit over the top. Instead, it's done, I think, much more wittily and much more economically in the scene with the baby. A sweet old lady, a baby in a pram. We expect delighted gurgles all round. Instead, the infant, who of course we never see, sets up a frantic wail rocking the pram. That baby knows a walking disaster area when it sees one. And that, of course, is precisely what Mrs. Wilberforce, sweet and lovable though she is, turns out to be. All her well-meant humanitarian interventions, although typically British, she tends to favour the animal over the human being, result in destruction, chaos, and at least 3 people out of a job. Any minute now we'll see a shot of the gang watching, their jaws dropping, unable to believe that one little old lady can cause so much chaos and mayhem in the space of a couple of minutes. They should take it as a warning.
Constable, I can explain.
Officer, look, he started it. And he's under my cab. Your cab? What about my barrow? What about my wagon? And where's my own?
There was another of McKendrick's favourite overhead crane shots. He did like those.
It's just sitting there. Look, could we...
No one, I hope, is going to suggest that we steal it.
That, I think, is one of my favourite lines from Alec Guinness. No one, I hope, is going to suggest that we steal it.
What's going on here, Sergeant?
Jack Warner, who we see here in charge of the police station, had probably his most famous and long-running role as a policeman. In The Blue Lamp, he was Sergeant Dixon and was gunned down about halfway through the film by a hysterical young hoodlum played by a very young Dirk Bogarde. However, his persona had a long afterlife. Not long after The Blue Lamp, BBC Television started a series called Dixon of Dock Green, in which Jack Warner took the title role and carried on playing Sergeant Dixon, apparently never getting any promotion until he was well into his 70s, probably the oldest police sergeant in the whole of London. Warner had actually been given his entree into films thanks to an ill-judged remark by Stanley Holloway. Back in 1946, the producer-director team of Michael Ralph and Basil Dearden were planning a film that took place in a prisoner of war camp in Germany towards the end of the war. And there was one role in it which they thought would be perfect for Stanley Holloway, who had appeared in one or two Ealing films. When Ralph phoned Holloway, his response was, "Oh, God, when I hear the word Ealing, my heart sinks." As you can imagine, this didn't go down too well with Ralph, and since Holloway, possibly because of his aversion to Ealing, and a lot of actors surprisingly didn't like working at Ealing, they felt they weren't treated with quite enough reverence, Holloway was asking quite a sizable sum. Around this time, there was an up-and-coming young musical comedian called Jack Warner, whose catchphrase was, "Mind my bike." Ralph had recently been to see him and suggested to Dearden that possibly the role that they were going to give to Stanley Holloway could go to this young chap, Jack Warner, as indeed it did. Jack Warner's career never looked back. A couple of years after The Captive Heart, though, and very unusually for him, he played a villain in Hue and Cry, the first of the Ealing comedies. And again, come to think of it, in a war picture called Against the Wind. And he did make rather a good villain. But like a lot of actors, he didn't really like playing villains. He liked to be loved. And went off to play Dixon of Dock Green for at least a couple of decades. And that's probably how he'll always be best remembered.
How about that? Eh? How about that?
Now we're approaching the turning point of the film. What McKendrick, an admirer of Aristotle's dramatic theory, liked to call the peripeteia. The Ladykillers takes the classic form of the heist movie, as laid down by John Huston's The Asphalt Jungle, Jules Dassin's Rififi, or Stanley Kubrick's The Killing. In the first half of a classic heist movie, a disparate band of crooks, each with a different skill, get together to pull off a job. In the second part, through internal dissension or human error, it all falls apart. It's a plot structure that lends itself well to comic treatment, since there's something inherently funny in watching an elaborately devised structure disintegrate at the tug of a single loose thread. In fact, Ealing had already produced a heist comedy in The Lavender Hill Mob, directed in 1951 by Charles Crichton, which observed the conventions of the genre while sending them up. But Crichton's film, lively and inventive though it is, works only by diffusing any real sense of danger. Its criminals are essentially innocuous. One can't imagine them committing any serious violence, let alone killing anyone. The Ladykillers restores the element of danger. Both films are fantasies, their criminals stylized and unreal, but McKendrick's gangsters exert the menace of the nightmare. The moment at which things start to fall apart in the Ladykillers can be precisely pinpointed. And here it is, when one round, lingering to say goodbye to Mrs. Lopsided, as he's taken to calling her, gets the strap of his cello case caught in her front door. From here on, it's all downhill.
It's stuck in the door. The case is...
We'll ring the bell, Brains. Don't just stand there.
And this, too, is the point at which sweet, innocent little Mrs. Wilberforce becomes transformed into something far more formidable. A few years ago, The Ladykillers, as I'm sure you know, was remade by the Coen brothers, who are exceptionally talented filmmakers, but their version flopped with the critics and at the box office, and I think it's not hard to see why. They relocated the action to the American Deep South, fair enough, but in place of Mrs. Wilberforce, their heroine was a tough, outspoken little old black lady called Irma P. Hall. The first time we see Irma, she's barreling across the road to bawl out the white sheriff in his own office. So we know from the start that she's one very tough cookie, more than a match for any bunch of lowlifes unwise enough to invade her house. And the central joke of the film is lost, whereas in McKendrick's original version, we're given the full force of Mrs. W's transformation. From a sweet, slightly daffy old lady, Louis's lopsided old grandma, she suddenly mutates into that dreaded figure, the British nanny, ultimate repository of domestic authority and moral certitude, and as such she establishes an immediate, paralysing ascendancy. Before her outraged glare, the gang shrink in stature, with Marcus peering shamefacedly over the incriminating newspaper headline, like a small boy caught with a catapult. She even slaps Louis's wrist. She also seems to acquire cloning ability. As if to bolster her authority, she summons up a whole battery of auxiliary aunts and nannies who swamp the gang and bear them off into her genteel parlour. Here the threatening antisocial impulse is marked off, one old lady per criminal, to be tamed with teacups and lace doilies. In this scene, the gang seems scarcely less anachronistic than the Victorian ladies. They look like reformed East End villains press-ganged into a Salvation Army prayer meeting. Even their cover is reduced to a patent sham. Marcus, the supposed leader of a talented string quintet, accompanies the singing dejectedly hunched over a player piano.
You're wondering about the money in Mr. Lawson's cello case.
Well, it's only natural that you should.
I don't think we told you that Mr. Lawson sold his butcher shop in Hammersmith.
That's right, I did.
Yes, he got the cash for it because there wasn't time to write a check.
I still don't quite understand.
You're wondering about the music. You're wondering how Mr. Mr. Lawson...
We're about to meet Mrs. Wilberforce's equally Victorian friends. The last one to arrive, the one who brings with her the newspaper and the news of the robbery at King's Cross, is played by a much-loved Ealing bit part player, Edie Martin, who played little old ladies, and she was even shorter than Katie Johnson. She played little old ladies in so many films. She's always completely recognisable and always absolutely delightful. She's the woman in The Man of the White Suit who finally gives Alec Guinness his coup de grace when he's on the run from the bosses and the workers. And she turns up and she's his ex-landlady with her basket of washing because she takes in washing to supplement her income. And Guinness, whose character up to then has been the completely self-absorbed scientist, utterly unaware of anyone else's viewpoint, is stopped completely in his tracks by this old lady. He runs up to her because he's so visible in his white suit, asking if she's got a blanket or something to cover himself with. And instead of giving him one, she says, "Why can't you scientists leave things alone? What's to become of my bit of washing when there's no more washing to do?" It's a heart-stopping moment, and Guinness just stands there. Suddenly he's realised that what he does has consequences for other people. Edie Martin was lovely casting for that. This is her now, standing in front of Alec Guinness. She also shows up in another film, scripted by William Rose, the much-loved car comedy Genevieve. In that, a young couple, played by John Gregson and Dinah Sheridan, arrive at a ghastly backstreet Brighton hotel, hot, sweaty, dirty, only to discover that, as is the way of English hotels, they can only have hot water between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. They explode in fury to the astonishment of the manageress, played by Joyce Grenfell, who says, "Oh, nobody's ever complained before." And as they storm off, up trots little Edie Martin. "Are they Americans?" she asks. Given that that was written by an American, I think you can see an example of what I said about Rose's mix of affection and exasperation with his adopted country.
I can't help it. I'm very sorry. Hypatia, I was asking you to step into the sitting room. I want to tell the Major. I can't help it, my dear. I'm very sorry.
Slip out. Move the car into the next row.
All right.
Leave that here.
Professor Marcus, I take it there's no need.
Here she is, the formidable nanny figure, the shamefaced expressions of her delight. Louis tries to strong-arm his way through it and is just completely defeated by this wash of little old ladies in their pastel clothes. And the fact that they're all short and the gang are all taller than them just makes it even funnier. McKendrick always thought in terms of images. He was an artist. He trained as an artist at the Glasgow School of Art, and his films are thought out very much in terms of images. He nearly always storyboarded his films. One or two frames of his storyboard for The Man in the White Suit still exist, and they are wonderfully vivid and very skillful. Alas, most of them got thrown away or burnt. How much one would love to have the storyboards for the Ladykillers. Who knows, they may turn up one day.
You know, at the bottom of the garden, there's a most jolly little... Didn't you hear me say, dear, we'll just go in the sitting room? Yes, if you don't mind, I'm sure they'll come by and by. Well, there's nothing for it. You'll have to come in. But please remember this. These are some of my oldest and closest friends. They mustn't get the slightest inkling of this disgraceful affair. Oh, really, this is the most embarrassing position.
Embarrassing and humiliating.
Simply try.
There's another wonderful Guinness line. Embarrassing and humiliating. Guinness's line readings are some of the greatest delights of this film. It's probably his finest comic role. It is for me anyway, although The Man in the White Suit runs it close.
Now, we will go in.
So in they go, into the parlour. And once again, Rose makes wonderful use of a sentimental old Victorian drawing room ballad. In this case, Silver Threads Among the Gold. The last line of the chorus is pointed. Life is fading fast away. So it is, but not for the old ladies. None of these crooks, let's remember, has more than about another 12 hours to live. Some reviewers, when the film came out, were quite shocked by the fact that the gang all got killed off. They felt that they were too lovable. But as I said earlier, McKendrick was very good at the sordid carpentry of laying fuses. Everything that happens in The Ladykillers is laid out with beautiful dramatic inevitability in the first 10 or 15 minutes of the film. It is a very well-constructed film.
I thought they'd never go home.
Mrs. Wilberforce, I don't think you quite understand.
But now the guests have gone, and the gang still have enough spirit to mount a counter-attack.
You see, in this case, it would do no good to take the money.
Marcus ingratiatingly organises a task force to help Mrs. Wilberforce with the washing up. Such good boys, really. And tries successively economics sleight of hand. How much harm have we done anybody, Mrs. Wilberforce? 1 farthing's worth. And when that fails, a sob story from the Major. And, as I mentioned earlier, originally there were going to be 2 sob stories, one from Harry. And you can very exactly see where that fitted in. There aren't many awkward cuts in this film, but there is one after the Major's story, and we get a cut to Harry in tears. It works reasonably well. You can accept it as Harry reacting to the Major's story. But that's where Peter Sellers lost one of his best speeches, much to his chagrin.
I assure you, if we try...
Sellers, incidentally, was a huge fan of Alec Guinness. He could do a remarkably accurate parody of Guinness's voice. And on one occasion, during the course of the shoot, he showed up on the set with multiple copies of an audio tape he had made at home. Sellers loved gadgets and was one of the first people to have a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And he had made a spoof trailer for the Ladykillers in which he imitated the voices of all his fellow actors and of McKendrick. And he presented copies of this tape to everybody as a kind of little calling card, I suppose. His imitation of McKendrick sent up McKendrick's famous perfectionism. We hear a rather disgruntled clapper boy saying, "Ladykillers, scene 14, take 86. Then follows some high-speed gibberish from Sellers, after which McKendrick is heard saying, "Peter, that's good, that's very good, we'll do it again."
But with high hope that she has nothing more to fear. My mother.
each of them could tell a similar story. I planned the robbery, Mrs. Wilberforce. I wanted to help them.
No, I
Once
don't
again,
think,
we're at an
even if
impasse.
what you say is true.
Mrs. Wilberforce's Victorian values are proving too strong for all the gang's persuasion and blandishment.
Madam, how can you be so harsh? You're a...
And so now, persuasion having failed, Marcus changes tactics and, backed up to his confederates, applies threats.
Right, Mr. Harvey, we've got to tell her. Mrs. Wilberforce, I wanted to spare you this, but I'm afraid the police are after you, too.
Here, as in the heist sequence, we see the gang at their best. Communicating intuitively, they pick up each other's cues, playing their respective roles, hard or soft, skillfully off against each other, ideas developed and capped, tossed from one to the next like an operatic Shana. Mrs. Wilberforce has lost the initiative, excluded from their complicity and glancing bewildered from face to face. She stands isolated at the edge of the group like an unpopular schoolchild.
Oh, but this is ridiculous. I know the superintendent. I shall deny any knowledge.
Never stand up to it, of course. A grilling.
This combined assault almost breaks her resistance. When the kindly police sergeant shows up at the door, she confusedly parrots the gang's jargon, buttoned up, search warrant, and dismisses the poor man with what by her standards verges on strong language. Then will you please buzz off?
Planned the big one.
But their hypnotic control is less than perfect. She fluffs her lines, and Marcus, wincing and wrapping himself agitatedly in a curtain, seems less Dr. Mabuse than Wizard of Oz.
Oh dear, what am I going to do? What am I going to do?
It's Bogey. Bogey? No. Look, back way.
Stay where you are.
Don't answer it.
You must answer it.
The police sergeant, incidentally, is another recurrent extra in Ealing films. Although star actors tended to dislike working at Ealing, Stuart Granger loathed it and felt he was never given the respect that it was his due. Bit part players loved it because they got employment film after film, and we're about to see another of them now, Philip Stainton, who plays the friendly police sergeant. He also plays the resident policeman in Passport to Pimlico. If you were a bit part actor in those days, typecasting probably wasn't that much of a problem.
For the rest of your life, do you be sensible just for once? Stay buttoned up.
Buttoned up. Yes?
Good evening, Mrs. Wilberforce.
Every so often, McKendrick puts in a little bit of slapstick. Not too much. That would overbalance the film. It isn't, after all, a slapstick comedy. But small details like the Major knocking a saucepan off the shelf and frantically catching it is entirely in character. Probably the difference between good and bad comedy is that characters never come out of character to get a laugh.
Professor Marcus.
If Louis had knocked that saucepan off the shelf, that would have been out of character and it wouldn't have felt right. For the Major, it's absolutely right. And that applies all through Ladykillers. All the humour derives from character. McKendrick always used to say that action should derive from character and not the other way around. And he puts that into effect very effectively in the Ladykillers.
Coming.
Oh, don't let him in. Whatever he says, just tell him to buzz off.
You're quite sure you're all right, Mrs. Wilbur?
Of course I'm all right. Now, will you please buzz off?
That really is as near as Mrs. Wilberforce could possibly get to swearing.
He's going away. Was that all right?
But the spell, as is the way of spells, doesn't last. It very soon wears off.
Piece of advice.
Back in her sitting room, in the strengthening presence of her household gods, the 3 parrots and the portrait of the late Captain Wilberforce, Mrs. Wilberforce regains her moral compass and her own voice. No, she says. No, I was quite wrong. I know what we must do, even if they do make me sew mailbags. As she speaks, McKendrick tracks gently into a close-up, just as he did when she was recalling her 21st birthday party at Pangbourne.
listen, Mum, and listen with both ears. We've had just about all we're going to take from you. You don't seem to realize...
The word Pangborn was something of a talisman for William Rose. He works it into nearly all his scripts somewhere. This camera movement links the two speeches. There we were shown the source of her strength, and this is the product of it. And as she speaks of giving herself up, she glances up at the portrait of her late husband. He looks, it's worth noting, rather like Admiral Gascoigne in Kind Hearts and Coronets. And like the Admiral, he remained at the salute on the bridge as his ship went down in the China Sea, but only ineffably British to the last after ensuring the safety of the Parrots. The Admiral, of course, was, like all the Gascoigne clan, played by Alec Guinness, so perhaps the captain represents Marcus's good demon, that little touch of goodness in the Professor that will destroy him.
How about suicide?
Yet Kind Hearts invited us to mock the Admiral's self-sacrifice as bone-headed patrician obstinacy. Hamer's mockery, McKendrick seems to hint, was in vain. The world of the Gascoignes is alive and well in the England of 1955, where the most fatuous behaviour may still furnish a moral precedent.
Who's going to do it?
I couldn't. I should be terrified of, well, muffing it. I mean to say.
It ought to be someone experienced in...
Throughout the Ladykillers, as night falls, the tone darkens and the shadows once again gather in the corners, our responses are unsettled by this shifting play of irony, leaving us uncertain where our sympathies are supposed to lie. Mrs. Wilberforce's courage is admirable, and we're clearly meant to find it so, yet taken to this degree, innocence and moral rectitude are tantamount to a provocation. From the old lady's face, gazing trustingly upwards at her husband's portrait, the camera slides sideways to the gang, glowering and frustrated, and on the soundtrack, Rule Britannia modulates into the murder motif. And I must admit my favourite part of the film, perhaps I share Sandy McKendrick's perverted and malicious sense of humour. From now on, it's one death after another, right to the end of the film. And we're about to see, reprised, the earlier scene where the Professor... There again, that's a lovely little piece of totally in character slapstick, one round pushing the locked door open. As I was saying, we'll get a reprise now, only in a deadlier mode, of the earlier scene where the Professor asked for votes on his plan, only now it's drawing lots for murder. McKendrick uses very few close-ups. In all his work, there are probably no more than a couple of dozen. When he does use them, as he does here, it's always with a very specific purpose in mind. This scene, with its concentration on faces and hands, is almost Bressonian. Look at that hand, the shuddering hand of the poor Major, and we know exactly which match he's going to take. The gradual elimination of the gang members proceeds in reverse order of their lethal nature. The poor Major, the most harmless and bumbling of them, is inevitably going to be the first to go.
All right. Go ahead. I lost. I'll do it.
McKendrick had already made superb use of Cecil Parker in his previous film, The Man in the White Suit, where Parker plays the woolly liberal head of the textile company who finds himself caught between Alec Guinness's scientist and the hard men of the textile industry. Parker was always very good at playing a rather windy, hypocritical decency. And here again, we see him crumbling under pressure. In The Man in the White Suit, there's a scene where the young scientist who has been captured by the textile bosses makes his escape, and as he does so, tussles with Cecil Parker, who collapses feebly, saying, "I will not countenance violence." 2 minutes later, of course, the scientist is knocked out. There's a lovely cameo performance by Cecil Parker in a Kenneth More film called The Comedy Man. Moore plays an out-of-work struggling actor, and at one point, one of his colleagues, played by Cecil Parker, shows up, and within a minute of his appearance on screen, his ratty Astrakhan collar coat and his fruity old boy accent tells us immediately that the man is a charlatan.
Yes, Major Courtney?
She had to go. She asked for it. She's probably been asking for it all her life.
Yeah. Look at she done to that barrow boy and a cabbie and a junkman. All of them out of business in 10 minutes.
I promise you, Mrs. Wilberforce, they've no intention of letting you take them to the police.
Oh, but Professor Marcus said
He
that...
was lying. At this very moment, they believe me to be bargaining for your silence. These men are criminals.
Again, this is Parker's speciality, this kind of windy hypocrisy. See the way the shadows have darkened. The time scale of Ladykillers is interesting. Up to the point where the robbery takes place, it's hard to tell quite how much time has elapsed. It might be a couple of days, it might be a week. But from the heist itself to the end, we have a pretty exact time scale. It's from midday to mid-morning. So it's about 20 hours, and the time of day is beautifully created. The lighting, we always know where we are, we know when we are, and all the deaths take place during the night hours, of course.
To reach the officers of the law and bring them back with me. You do trust me.
Yes, but...
The lighting and the framing from this point onwards almost seem to anticipate another famous English genre of filmmaking which was just about to start. Hammer horror. The Curse of Frankenstein, the first of the classic Hammer horror films, was only a year away. And looking at Danny Green there standing in the doorway, couldn't that come straight out of one of Hammer's zombie films?
Major.
What's taking him so long?
The lighting, the colours, and there, Mrs. Wilberforce as the corpse, the walking corpse. It's almost as though there's a continuity being set up between the decline of Ealing and the rise of Hammer.
The Major's gone.
Well, all the money's in the cello case now, so we know it's the £60,000 that McKendrick insisted upon. And Mrs. Wilberforce is learning the jargon. She's staying buttoned up.
He didn't go the back way.
He's done it. He took the lot.
I've nothing to say. I'm going to stay buttoned up.
Louis! On the roof! On the roof, quickly!
And the Major's up on the roof again. This was foreshadowed, of course, in the scene with the escaped parrot. I said earlier that there's a cartoon quality to the gang, and there's also a cartoon quality to the violence. Although there are lethal falls, a stabbing, someone battered to death with a plank, and indeed a shooting, we never see any blood. Somehow blood would be too realistic. McKendrick said that one should always be very conscious one's making a fantasy and should never step outside the the fantasy boundaries. And that's what happens in the killings. They're quite brutal, but we never actually see anyone killed. It's always just slightly off screen. When Harry is battered with a plank by one round, we hear the impact. We see the plank start to swing down. We don't see the impact on Harry. And that goes for all the killings. They're all just that little bit off screen. More ineffable bluster from Cecil Parker. Old man, the idea's preposterous. And there's one of Tristram Carey's best train whistle effects, turning into a scream. I think Hitchcock used that one first, but a lot of people have used it very well since. All the fuses that McKendrick laid earlier are just starting to detonate. The gang is starting to splinter.
We'll talk about this when the police get here. It's long past my bedtime, and I've had a most exhausting day.
Well, where is he? Where is the Major? Is he up there still?
No, he come down.
Oh, bring him here.
He come down with the chimney pot.
The chimney? Is he hurt?
I shouldn't think you felt a thing.
And there, the distorted, dying fall of Tristram Carey's music tells us exactly where we are and where we're going. From here on in, it's inevitable. We can see what's coming. It's just a question of seeing how exactly it plays out. The acting and the writing in these scenes is so exact, so well thought through, that I think, if you don't mind, I'll just be quiet for 10 minutes or so and let us enjoy it. And then I'll pick it up towards the end.
I sat there when we thought the Major was doing it. Okay, I've had enough. If we were going to do it, we should have done it and got it over with.
Yeah, you're being stupid.
Okay, I'm stupid. But nobody touches Mrs. Lopsided. Nobody.
I see. Maybe one round is right.
What?
As one round says, the first thing to do is to lose the poor old Major. There's a wheelbarrow out there. Would you mind fetching it, please?
What for?
The Major has a train to catch.
Harry and Louis are desperate men. We must be careful.
Let's get this clear. No one is running out now. That goosehead is
Reliable.
And dangerous.
I had to sweeten him.
That leaves the three of us.
all right.
Stop declining, will you? Come on.
All right, Harry. I'll give one round a hand. You stay with Louis.
too noisy, eh? No, I can manage all right, thank you. Now, look, Mum. We're in a tough spot. Don't shout out. Warren.
I think one round you'd better fetch the car. Here is the key. There's no need to go through the house.
Hey, Professor, you wouldn't be trying to get me out of the way, would you?
Don't be stupid, one round.
Don't call me that. Just don't call me stupid. Just tell me what's going on. Hey, what are they doing in there?
No, it wasn't me.
No,
look! It was Harry! He's got the money, he's gone!
You done her!
No, never! No, never! Where's your sense of humour, one round?
That must be perhaps the saddest line in the whole film. Poor Harry appealing to One Round's very obviously non-existent sense of humour. Though if you remember that Peter Sellers was voicing the parrots, he still has a little afterlife.
I said nobody was to do it! I said
Mr. Harvey!
nobody was to do Mrs. Lopsided!
Stop that! What
There is futile bashing on the head of One Round, who is obviously as insusceptible to being thumped with a cosh as to any kind of sense of humour.
Outside.
Somebody took the key. The cello case has gone.
It's out there too.
Well, bring it in.
By this stage, Mrs. Wilberforce is just completely invincible.
Somebody took the key out of my pocket. I'm very angry.
As you have every right to be. It's disgraceful, Mrs. Wilberforce. Shameful. Mr. Robinson will answer for it.
It's interesting that after this scene, all the action moves outside the house. Mrs. Wilberforce's territory becomes entirely her own, and the final scenes between the last three members of the gang are played out outside.
What happened?
I thought they'd done her in. I thought Harry done her.
So?
So, all right. I made a mistake.
Put him in the barrow.
No.
What? What are you saying?
You lose, Harry. I'm staying with Mum.
Oh, have you any idea what's making the officers so long in coming?
All right. But afterwards, before we do her, we have to take care of him.
What my husband would have said about all this if he were alive. Captain Wilberforce was in the Mercantile Marines. He went down with his ship, 29 years ago, in a typhoon in the China Sea. These 3 little creatures were with him. He kept them in his cabin. Captain Wilberforce made sure they were safely on the last boat, but he himself remained at the salute on the bridge.
Look, I make a proposition to you. I'll take care of
Another
him.
nice, subtle little piece of filmmaking there. Just enough to establish, A, that One Round has picked up Harry's gun, and B, that he's not very familiar with the workings of it, as we're about to see.
Take care of Mrs. W.
Wait.
Another element that was in the original script, but I don't think was ever even filmed, was the rather fanciful idea that, as a kind of coda, various bodies in various northern-bound trains would be seen arriving, rather to the bemusement of the railway staff, all over Scotland and the north of England. It's a nice idea, but I don't think it's really needed.
Away by yourself, I'll help you. Do him. He's the one who got you into this. Do him.
I heard you. Both of you. I've been standing here all the time. Sure, you two were going to put me on the train, and all the time you've been telling me how stupid I am, okay?
One Round seems to have picked up something of the professor's aversion to being called mad. He's decidedly not happy about being called stupid.
The safety catch was on.
The safety catch was on. Poor One Round. Dawn is breaking. And there's a shot that makes you wonder, is it all her dream? Is she dreaming them? Are they all figments of her imagination?
For the human element. All good plans include the human element, but then I admit you were right. No.
And here's the point where Marcus's mind finally breaks. He goes over the edge.
There were only 5 of us. Little, pum.
What's the matter? What's the matter with you? Take it easy, will you?
And it will take 20 or 30 or 40 perhaps to deal with her, because we'll never be able to kill her, Louis. She'll always be with us. Forever and ever.
Little skirls of music from Tristram Carey, showing that Marcus's mind is going, or in fact has probably by now gone.
You mustn't make me angry.
Now we're in pure Hammer horror territory. Swirls of smoke, disembodied voices. And even a touch of Macbeth. Burnham Wood, heading somewhere towards Dunsinane.
Over here, Louis.
I think we can see now why McKendrick was so delighted when he saw the location where he was going to build his house. and realised what he could do with those trains. As I said, McKendrick was a very visual director, and he picked up on those swirls of steam and smoke and knew that's what would be the ending of this film. The final act. The rivalry between Marcus and Louis reaches its final moments. Louis, who always objected, literally, to playing second fiddle.
What are you doing?
I won't keep you, Louis. There'll be another train soon.
We can guess that Marcus has been mortally wounded, but he doesn't even notice. All he's concerned with is his final triumph. And he has it for all of 10 seconds. And the last train leaves for the north. That house silhouette. We're in cartoon land again, aren't we?
It's true I carried the lolly.
And, of course, back to the police station and the nice police sergeant.
I admit the caper was planned in my house, but it wasn't I who planned it. And I did not plan or have anything to do with the East Castle Street job.
Didn't you, Mum?
East Castle Street is a little-known thoroughfare just north of Oxford Circus, and I can never walk along it without hearing Mrs. Wilberforce's voice.
Now, you'll forgive me, I'm rather late for an important conference.
I don't even know where East Castle Street is, she says.
I did want to ask your advice about some things.
What happened to the rest of the gang, Mum?
Well, that's the funny thing. They all disappeared during the night. But I have all the lolly. Oh, I beg your pardon, I'm so confused. I have all the money back at the house. You see, I took charge of it. And they were so alarmed, they simply disappeared.
They didn't have a spaceship, did they?
You're not...
Poor Mrs. Wilberforce, classed with her friend Amelia forever.
Really, Sergeant, you must think my mind is wandering.
No, Mrs. Wilberforce. It's just that, well, for various reasons, we want you to oblige us by forgetting all about the matter. And don't mention it to anyone.
Oh, I won't mention it, of course. But you'll send someone for the money.
Oh, I think as far as we're concerned, Mum.
Why don't you just keep the money?
Keep the money? I can't believe... Oh, I know it's only a farthing on everybody's policies, but... They said you wouldn't want the money back, that it would only confuse the issue.
That's right, Mrs. Wilberforce. Now, if you don't mind, I've got some very pressing business to attend
Yes,
to.
of course. Good morning.
Mrs. Wilberforce! Wait! Just a moment! You forgot it, Mum.
Oh, no, I don't think I want it. I never liked it. Now I can buy a dozen new ones. Oh, good morning, Sergeant.
And off she goes with that ineffably British ambition to buy a dozen new umbrellas and gives £1 to the nice man who's drawn a picture of Mr. Churchill. And her tune is no longer the ambiguous Boccherini. We're back to the last rose of summer again. As she heads back to her little house. And that's an interesting point. That chimney that came down with the Major is back again, so perhaps it was all a dream.